Facts. Yeah, facts. We tell you facts. All the facts.
But yeah, I'll get into some of the lore, I guess, let's talk about it. So what is a Kumiho, or it's also spelled with a G sometimes. Wikipedia defines the Kumiho as a nine-tailed fox spirit who preys on its victims by taking the form of a beautiful woman and oftentimes seducing men with the goal of consuming their life essence, hearts, and livers. It does remind me very vaguely of that incel website that described the succubus, because that is very much what they described as taking place, is their essence being stolen.
What makes them a man?
By this trickster lady. It's just really, the language specifically used to describe what the Kumiho does is very reminiscent of the succubus. And I don't know which one came first. So it could just be that there is a underlying wish to villainize the feminine form, women in general, that is cross-cultural, unfortunately. But the role of the Kumiho seems to lend similarly to that of the vampire, werewolf, succubus that we see in Western lore, and that the stories of the Kumiho always revolve around the consumption of essence or sometimes organs, not babies. That's not included with the Kumiho, but it's often women preying on men. Not exclusively. There are like a few, like at least one example of male Kumiho, but they're few and far between kind of thing. One thing that I really appreciate about the Kumiho is that it doesn't position the idea that women themselves are inherently evil. And ultimately, there's this underlying capacity for good if the Kumiho were to fully transition to a human. So it does kind of separate the feminine form somewhat from this evilness that I don't think you see with succubi or like werewolves. They're kind of like half human, half this. This kind of is like a spirit that exists and enters into these situations, but it can turn into a human though, which I thought was very interesting. The lore with the Kumiho does seem to differ from its Chinese and Japanese counterparts. The wiki article continues to say, while China's Hulijing and Japan's kitsune are often depicted as ambiguous moral compasses, possibly good or bad, the Kumiho is almost always treated as a malignant figure who feasts on human flesh. It is unclear at which point exactly in time Koreans began viewing the Kumiho as a purely evil creature, since many ancient texts mention the benevolent Kumiho assisting humans, and even makes mentions of wicked humans tricking the kind and naive Kumiho. In later literature, the Kumiho were often depicted as bloodthirsty, half fox, half human creatures that wandered cemeteries at night, digging human hearts out of graves. And something that was interesting about this is there is some history around like the different ways foxes interact. Specifically, like in Korea, that there was a frustration with them invading like their garden beds and like food sources. And possible instances of them digging literally up human graves because of like wanting to feed. That could have influenced like this negative viewpoint of the fox itself. In some of the lore, they're viewed as just the fox themselves are viewed as bad luck, whereas like in Japan and China, they're viewed more favorably, and kind of like as good creatures, not inherently bad creatures. An interesting piece of this reminds me of a familiar fear that could exist within vampire lore, in that to exist for thousands of years allows for the acquisition of a complex knowledge of humanity and its history, as well as its flaws. So the Kumiho itself is written with this understanding that it possesses a lot of knowledge, which is something kind of unique to the Kumiho in comparison to the Yulijing or the
Kitsune.
Yeah, I had to scroll for a second to make sure I said it. But yeah, so the Kumiho is also written as a creature of knowledge, sometimes carrying a book in its mouth or with a bead. That is both used as a way to steal the life force of a human, but also as a storage device for knowledge. And we see this in the method of getting this knowledge and these memories with Jia, and how through the sex and kiss and what have you. They're able to steal the memories of their victims. The essence of knowledge is something that's very unique to the Kumiho, though. The wiki article continues, the most distinctive feature that separates the Kumiho and its two counterparts, the Kitsune and the Hulijing, is the existence of the Yawu Guseo, which literally means fox marble / bead, which is said to consist of knowledge. According to Korean mythology, the Yawu Gonseo provides power to the Kumiho and knowledge and intelligence to people if they can steal it or swallow one. The Kumiho can absorb human energy with it, and the method of absorbing energy resembles a deep kiss. The Kumiho sends the Yawu Gonso into people's mouths and then retakes it with their tongue. So that's why they say the kiss has to have tongue, because that's their way of reclaiming this bead. The knowledge stealing is something that feels very unique, though, in comparison to other monstrous feminine creatures we've covered thus far. The intelligence associated with the Kumiho spirit is an interesting twist on the fear associated with it. I think in some ways that could be both from fear of knowing oneself fully, and knowing someone's life entirely, and being able to pass some form of judgment. We kind of see that in the relationship of Jia and Tik. But that there's this like fear that we see from Tik of Jia seeing who he actually is, his past, his history, as well as like who he is now, and being able to kind of like have all that information and pass like this kind of objective judgment on his character. And I think that's something that is a different element to the Kumiho that makes it a little more scary, because they're getting access to a piece of you, this vulnerable place that like no one else has ever seen. No one else has the capacity to see, because they can't physically see your memories or your actual life through your eyes. They can only really go off of like what you tell them. So I thought that was like a really interesting way to make that level of vulnerability really scary as well.
Yeah.
The lore of the Kumiho is something that's changed over time. So the Kumiho didn't always exist as this evil creature. Some speculate that modern violent image of the Kumiho was influenced during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Nevertheless, foxes often contained a negative image during the Koryo dynasty, specifically because... Never mind, I don't know. It existed in the Koryo dynasty, suggesting two different views could have coexisted in ancient Korea. So essentially, in this sense, the change in the lore was a reflection of the fears associated with the time, kind of like historiography operates, that life happens, and then the views of different fears and monsters are transformed to meet the need of like what needs to be understood in a way that isn't available. So in the sense, the change of the lore reflects the fears associated with the time. The violence of the war correlating to the violence of the spirit is something that could have been used in the lore to make sense of the horrors experienced during that time.
And like the Japanese vilifying Korean people as well. Like that's a important part.
Yeah, and the fact that
makes it easier to oppress them.
Yeah, but and also that like taking the kitsune and like making it their own in this very like different way than it's seen in Japanese culture as well, I think is something that like is they're kind of taking back power from that thing as well. But a modern and scary fun twist on the fox spirit is apparently in 2022, which is now very recently, it's believed that a possible kitsune has been released in Japan. The killing stone has split in two in Japan, unleashing what legend describes as an evil spirit trapped in the Seseo stone. So I'm going to share my screen.
Just at last time, just for future, when you share your screen, you can keep it there and just remove it from the screen.
Oh, so fancy. Okay.
Yeah.
So in a Guardian article titled Japan's Killing Stone Splits in Two, Releasing a Superstitions Amid the Sulfur Springs, says legend has it that there is an evil spirit trapped in the Seseo stone. So what happens now that the stone is broken? Woo. Okay. So, so essentially, in Japan, there is a mythology around this stone, the Seihoseki stone, or killing stone, and the object contains like the transformed corpse of Tamano no Mae, a beautiful woman who has been part of a secret plot hatched by a feudal warlord to kill Emperor Toba, who reigned between 1107 and 1123. The legend has it that her true identity was an evil nine-tailed fox whose spirit is embedded in the hunk of lava located in the area of Tochigi Prefecture near Tokyo, famous for its sulfurous hot springs. The stone recently has separated into two roughly equal parts and it believes to have occurred recently and has really scared people online who noted that according to folklore, the stone continually spews poisonous gas, hence the name. So people who touch it die because it leaks poisonous gas. There's also a theory that because a few years ago, it actually started the split. So rainwater was able to enter the crack in the rock and further like open it. But essentially people are worried that the demon spirit Tamano no Mae has been resurrected after almost 1,000 years of being held in this rock. And I think it's pretty telling considering like what life is right now. If it started the split in 2020.
Yeah.
That was the origin of a lot of bad stuff happening everywhere.
Yeah.
So if the idea
I didn't have that on my apocalypse bingo card.
Yeah. So it's obviously like we don't know, but that the lore associated with the stone in that it does have this element of poison gas, but also that there's this idea that there's a kitsune trapped within it that is now free and able to wreak havoc across Japan and elsewhere. I think it's really interesting considering like what life has been like in the most recent future and like the kind of implications of that. And it's like, is the pandemic really blamed on this kitsune? Do they have the power to do that? What is the actual, is there just like local phenomena taking place? Or is this like going to be something that people blame kind of local catastrophes on? I don't know. There's lots of like ways in which monsters can be used to kind of rationalize the happenings of the world. So it's interesting that there's like something very today adjacent that's taking place in reference to like a kitsune, not a kumiho, but still very like similar in that it's a nine-tailed fox spirit believed to be free.
And it was a woman who was causing havoc when she was alive. Because I when we were getting ready to do this episode, I saw this like TikTok.
Yeah, you sent it to me.
Yeah.
That's how I gained access to this knowledge.
Yeah. And they were like explaining that like she was this woman who was a nine-tailed fox and didn't want to like be what society was telling her to be, and eventually becomes a concubine to the emperor. And because of like their connection, and so like also depending like how concubines work during that time, right? Is like there was levels to them. There was like they had different roles that they played politically, and they can have a certain amount of power over those who were in charge. And so she had this connection with him, which made her kind of powerful and therefore a threat to the rest of the political forces. And so she was strategically murdered in that way to keep her. And it was under the guise of like, she's a kumiho, like she's bad. She's a bad spirit. We're saving everyone by murdering this woman who literally just like...
I'm glad you have this context because I forgot that part of it, and it's actually very good knowledge to have.
Yeah.
And it's potentially not even a fox spirit. It's literally just a murdered person who was unjustly murdered because they had autonomy and power in this situation. Wow.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And then, you know, like, and then if she wasn't a fox spirit, like hopefully she is now, and they put her into a rock and she can now have revenge in some way. Like if anything's going to turn you into a murderous nine-tailed fox spirit, I think it would be that. But that's literally like, she just was a woman who was operating outside of the norm of what was expected for women, and men got upset about it. And so when I heard that story, I was like, it's so perfect because we are talking about like, and it is a kitsune, but the fact that they have those similarities and the fact that it's a kumiho, in Korea. So I was just like, that's so like
Also, like, way for Google to be listening to our everyday life enough to like know that we were going to be talking about an Ideals Fox spirit, even if it is a different one, to be like, hey, did you know?
Yeah, TikTok
Now you have
algorithm
this
was
knowledge.
like,
So
I think you're going to be into this. This is a monstrous femme. And I was like, I am.
100%.
Works out in my favor. And I think like, yeah, I really enjoyed like this specific glimpse into the Kumiho and like that experience with Gia, because it is American media, which I think is also important. Like the actress,
a lot of my sources too were American sources too. I wasn't able. I mean, I don't read Korean, so I wasn't able to find like there were like one or two English translated ones that I pulled from, but like I guess recognizing our lens as well.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. And I think like specifically with this, like Jamie Chung is a Korean American, and that she comes from like immigrant parents, and like I read somewhere like they had spoken some Korean in the house, but like very brief conversational, so she had to learn a lot. And the fact that like they were like, we're going to make this whole episode majority Korean. She was like, oh, I gotta, like, I really gotta learn. But I thought that was like pretty amazing, especially with the fact that there is that character who has to kind of straddle these two identities of being Korean and American. So for this actress to do that. And I think also like that in the midst of a show that is so heavily about specific American experiences, to compare some of the struggles that are happening in an entirely different country, a country that we were occupied in, right? Like, and had no business being there. Like, there's so much to unpack in that. And the fact that
because the fear of communism, like,
there's so much fear of communism in it. And it's like, and I think that's also a big part is like when she's a red Martian, right? Like she's a red alien in the beginning. And I'm just like, I wonder.
It's the color tone because
she's red. But also like, I appreciate that she wasn't a secondary character in this scene. Like they didn't make it specifically about Tick, and that they took the time to make it a very Korean story, right? Like it's not just the fact that they were speaking Korean, but they didn't take the time to like over explain things, but they were still true. Like there's a lot of, like I said, like the cultural things that are still there within the framework of their stories, without it being confusing or trying to oversimplify it for Americans, like like dumb it down. Or like, oh, I don't know if Americans are going to understand this. It's like, because it's kind of like the oppression of women is something that every culture has experienced in some way, and so we can do that. And then also like this fear of the other and monstrosizing them in some way. Like, of course, like she can understand to a degree what Tick is going through because of that. And then he can understand her too.
Apparently too, the episode of the one podcast that I sent you, I don't remember the name of, but they were talking about the subtitles. And maybe we'll link it so that they still get credit. But the subtitles apparently were also like very respectful of the fact that like there are nuances to Korean honorifics that like Americans wouldn't understand. So instead of trying to translate them incorrectly, kind of like how Squid Games did, they left them like in their like spelled out so that like if you were curious, you could Google what uni meant.
Uma, they call her Oma and Opa. Yeah, I noticed that when since I was watching, and I did see that they use like the terminology for the way that you're talking, like you're using this speech versus this speech, and it was the Korean word in the subtitles. I did notice that because I was like, ooh, like, and they didn't like, you just kind of through context understand, because she then like kind of elaborates in being like, he wanted to be comfortable and kind of not use honorifics, and I was fine with that because I'm cool. And then immediately the next scene is Gia being like, Oppa, you're so amazing, like at the speed dating. And so you can see like she is performing what she just saw as the cool Youngja. And so you kind of get like, oh, maybe that's a part of the language thing. And like
you get
literally
like,
just that
into it, and like in a respectful way, that isn't always done. And I appreciated that the subtitles like were actually representative of what it was trying to express instead of like being like it means sir or grandpa
Yeah.
or like I don't remember what Squid Games translated it to, but it was goofy. Like it was wrong. Like it was not the right translation.
When they, like I think she changed it to like, yeah, maybe it did say sir instead of saying oppa, and then there was like that. Yeah, in this it says like oma. It was spelt out, and it was not like big brother or whatever, because people would be confused. Instead, you're just like, okay, this seems like an affectionate term.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's like more of a nickname than a.
Yeah.
And
I think for that, it's really like, and the entirety of Lovecraft Country, even what I appreciate about that show is that it trusts its audience to be smart and to have some just have the wherewithal to understand context and like do their own research if they have to. And there's so many like films and especially in horror sometimes where we over explain or we're just, and that annoys me when you're like, my audience are idiots. They are so dumb, big old dum-dums. I have to explain every single thing to them in this very elaborate way. And I'm just like, oh, I'm like tapped out now because I'm like, how dare you?
Well, yeah, like the goal instead would be to be like, one, set it up so it's easy to look up what the thing would be. And then also like, as I said in the Don't Look Up episode, I want there to be next steps at the end of a thing, not during it, so that you're like, okay, what are we doing? I want it to be like, here's all the things you should know at the end, so that you read like what is it called? The things with this text that scrolls.
Credits.
Thanks, babe.
Read your credits. Read those things.
I want those to have those things, though. That's all I'm saying.
Yes. But yeah, there's so much to unpack just in this one episode. So just imagine what the whole series would be. And like I said, one day we'll cover all of Lovecraft Country. But yeah, I hope you really enjoyed this episode about the Kumiho and specifically Gia and her experience. And just like the fact that we might have a real like Kitsune out there ready to take vengeance on people. I'm very excited for her.
I mean, like honestly,
redemption arc, her revenge. It's so exciting. Actually, it's funny because that podcast you were talking about and how I said it reminded me of stuff we missed in history class. I listened to this episode about this like maybe Venezuelan. Whatever, it was royalty in a Spanish speaking country. And there's like this love that was like forbidden. And eventually like the political people like murdered her. And she's known as like this ghost bride. And I remember being very disappointed at the end of the story that she didn't become like an actual ghost that like sought vengeance, like that wasn't a part of the lore. And I was like, where's that? I'm gonna like take this story and be like, actually she became a really cool like vengeful monster and she like murdered all the bad things. And it doesn't even matter that like her husband just happened to be really sad about it. And it's like, it's not enough that her kids are like validated and get to be in line to inherit the throne. That doesn't matter to me. She was wrongfully murdered. So
it's like this whole thing too. You also, it's like vengeance, conflict, but also like, do it. But also like, don't. But like, also like, but it's tough. It's the human experience is complicated. And honestly, though, like, okay, so say Kumihos are real and they exist. Similar vein to they know everything about humanity and how trash it is and how garbage, and then they intervene with divine judgment. Like, it's kind of like our fear of aliens. And then, like, if they came down and were like, wow, y'all suck. Let's just explode the whole planet.
Could you even argue against it?
Yeah. So, it's just, like, interesting. That's just very interesting. That there it manifests even in monster lore.
With that being said, don't get married.
Delete your kids. Or don't have kids. Or don't be a person. Just be a monstrous individual.
Yeah. Embrace it. We've done monstrous things, but we're not monsters.